So we left off talking about protists. Now we're going to continue on to another kingdom in the domain Eukarya, which are the fungi. Fungi may seem plant-like at first glance, but they're actually more closely related to animals. And we know this based off their genetics, their evolutionary history, and even their feeding behavior. So let's go over the basic characteristics of fungi. Remember, again, we're in the Eukarya now, and because fungi are eukaryotes, their cells have a nucleus. Like plants, fungal cells also have a cell wall, but you'll see that fungi and plant cells are very different. Again, both are eukaryotes, so they both have a nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles, and both do have a cell wall. However, the cell wall in plants is made up of cellulose. In fungi, the cell wall is made up of a different substance called chitin. Chitin is a carbohydrate and is also what makes up the exoskeletons of insects. So here is just another example of their similarity to animals. Another difference between fungal and plant cells is that fungi don't have chloroplasts, which are where photosynthesis takes place in plant cells. So unlike plants, fungi don't need light to grow. Most fungi are multicellular. However, there are single-celled fungi. These are called the yeasts. The main part of a fungus's body is the mycelium, which is made up of filaments called hyphae. While you may picture a mushroom when you think of fungi, mushrooms are just a small part of the fungus's body. The main part of the fungus is usually underground or in some type of substrate that the fungus is growing on. So this main part of the fungus's body, which again you might not even see unless you dig it up, is a network of filaments called hyphae. All the hyphae together make up the mycelium. So again, we mentioned that fungi are not photosynthetic like plants. Their cells don't have chloroplasts. Instead, they're heterotrophs like animals. Their food can come from a lot of different sources, depending on the species of fungus. Many are decomposers that break down dead organic material, but others form symbiotic relationships with other organisms to get their nutrients. So again, as heterotrophs, fungi get their energy by digesting organic molecules. They digest their food outside of their body. The hyphae release strong enzymes that digest and break down the materials they're growing in or through. For example, this might be dead organisms, such as rotting logs. Once those materials are digested, the nutrients are absorbed into the cells of the hyphae. Many fungi get their nutrients from organic material, such as rotting plant material, other dead organisms, or animal waste. Because of this, they are important decomposers in most terrestrial environments. Without decomposers, we would be walking on piles of dead plants, animals, and waste. So fungi play a very important role in breaking down organic material. However, some fungi get their energy from living organisms through symbiosis. You'll see later that many fungi have close relationships with plants, where they help the plant get certain resources, like water, in exchange for nutrients. But some fungal symbionts can also be parasites that harm the living organism that they extract nutrients from. So if the mycelium is the main body of the fungus, then what are mushrooms? Mushrooms are actually just a temporary reproductive structure that fungi produce, somewhat similar to flowers in plants. So while we tend to associate fungi with mushrooms, again, these are just temporary structures for reproduction, known as fruiting bodies. You may have noticed that mushrooms don't last very long. They pop up and often disappear in a few days. But when the mushrooms are gone, the fungus is not dead. The mycelium is still alive inside the substrate. So we mentioned that mushrooms are just temporary reproductive structures. But let's talk more about fungal reproduction because it's really weird and interesting. Fungi can produce spores, similar to some plants, and the spores are usually produced in and released by mushrooms. But fungi can also reproduce using their hyphae. And both of these two methods of reproduction can be either sexual or asexual. I know, I said it was weird, right? Okay, so let's look at these different forms of reproduction. Spores are cells that once they're dispersed, grow into a new organism. And again, spores can be produced through either sexual or asexual reproduction. So two fungi may sexually reproduce, exchange genetic material, and produce spores that can go out and grow into new fungi. Or an individual fungus can asexually produce its own spores and send out little clones of itself. The purpose of mushrooms is to release these spores. When the fungus is ready to reproduce, it produces mushrooms, which are really just specialized hyphae. Those mushrooms produce spores, which may be carried away on the air or in water, so the new fungi can colonize a new area. The spores of different fungal species are different colors and look different under a microscope, so they can be used to help identify species. Mycologists, or people who study fungi, often make spore prints to help identify a fungus. You can do this at home with mushrooms from the grocery store. All you need to do is set a mushroom gill side down on a piece of paper and add a little water to the top of the mushroom cap. The moisture will encourage the mushroom to release its spores, creating a spore print. So again, the mushrooms are formed from the mycelium. They're really just specialized bundles of hyphae. The fungus fuses together hyphae that are specialized for producing and releasing spores to produce a mushroom. To maximize the likelihood that its spores will be able to germinate, the fungus only produces mushrooms when conditions are just right and times the release of its spores for when the temperature and moisture levels are best for germination. Because of this, mushrooms are usually very short-lived, often lasting only a few days. But we mentioned fungi can reproduce in another way as well, using their hyphae. If a piece of the hyphae breaks off, it can continue to grow, forming a new mycelium that is a separate new organism. This is similar to rooting a cutting from a plant. Because there is only one individual involved here and no exchange of genetic material, this is asexual reproduction. But it gets weirder. Fungi can also use their hyphae for sexual reproduction. When the hyphae of two different fungi of the same species come into contact, they can actually fuse the cells together in their hyphae, creating new hyphae that have genetic material from both parents. So again, both forms of reproduction, either through spores or through the hyphae, can be either sexual or asexual reproduction. So if we can't see the whole fungus, just how big can they get? A fungus's mycelium can get very huge and expand over an enormous area. In fact, the largest organism on Earth is believed to be a yellow honey mushroom fungus that has taken over an area of about 4 square miles in Malheur National Forest. You can see that area here in yellow compared to the size of a football field in green. That's an absolutely massive organism. We mentioned that fungi are usually either decomposers or they get their nutrients by forming a symbiotic relationship with a living organism. A symbiosis is any close interaction between two organisms. There are many types of symbiosis, from mutualisms where both organisms benefit, to parasitic relationships where one benefits and the other is harmed. Most plants have symbiotic relationships with fungi called mycorrhizae. The network of hyphae making up the mycorrhizae's mycelium are interwoven with plant roots in the soil. The fungi help digest certain nutrients so that they can be more easily taken up by plant roots, and they also provide water to the plant. By doing this, they serve as an extension of the plant's root system, drawing water and nutrients from an area larger than the plant could do on its own. Mycorrhizae also do a lot of other cool things, like producing plant growth hormones and chemicals that help the plant's immune system. So most plants are very dependent on their mycorrhizae. In return, the fungi get plant sugars as its nutrients. This graph shows plants grown with mycorrhizae in turquoise and plants grown without mycorrhizae in the darker blue. On the y-axis, we have the number of plants surviving, and on the x-axis, we have time. You can see that early on, all the plants survive, but over time, some start to die off. However, more plants in the group grown with mycorrhizae, so the lighter color bar, survived than those grown without the beneficial fungus. So these data show you the benefit these plants are getting from their relationship with symbiotic fungi. Because mycorrhizae are so important to plant health, some plants actually launch chemical attacks against the mycorrhizae of their competition. One example is garlic mustard, which you've probably seen before. It's a very widespread invasive species from Europe that can quickly invade an area. It does this by secreting chemicals from its roots that damage the mycorrhizae of local native plants. Because the native plants are weakened by the loss of their mycorrhizae, they can't compete with the garlic mustard, and it quickly takes over the area. But fungi don't just form symbiotic relationships with plants. There are also fungi that form very close relationships with algae, which, as you might remember from the last exam, are protists. You've probably seen lichens on trees or rocks, and maybe you assumed they were either plants or fungi. But they're actually a collection of 2 or more species of fungi and algae. The fungus provides water and helps break down nutrients, while the algae undergoes photosynthesis to provide sugars for nutrition. The protists and fungi that form these relationships are almost always found together and usually can't live without each other. Because of this, they are often treated as single species, even though they are made up of multiple species.